Great. Good morning. As you know, my name is Lisa Loomis, and I'm the co-owner and editor of the Valley Reporter, which serves the Mad River Valley and Central Vermont. It is also my honor to serve as president of the Vermont Press Association, which represents the interests of 4 dozen daily and non-daily newspapers in the state. The Vermont Press Association is deeply concerned on behalf of its members throughout the state, but also the public, that there is a new effort to make state government less transparent and potentially give very special treatment to the Vermont Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The Press Association is equally concerned by efforts by groups seeking to have the Senate Government Operations Committee weaken Vermont's open meeting law by creating a way for boards to hold completely digital meetings and not providing a home base for the public, including the handicapped and low-income folks, to be able to attend and participate in the public process. We feel that H. 649 chips away at the hard work by recent legislators to make Vermont a more transparent state. And before any work on these two bills, S55 and H. 649, goes further, members of both Vermont legislative chambers would be well served to take a deep dive into the current problems with the state's open meeting law. S55 and H. 649 are problematic in many ways. Both bills share a commitment to allowing public bodies to meet electronically with no physical location for members of the public to participate. The VPA has testified against codifying this COVID-era exception into open meeting law in 2021, 2022, and 2023. Our reasons remain the same. The public has the right to attend and participate in the public process, regardless of whether they have a smartphone, laptop, or tablet. This is an equity and equal access to the public process issue. The VPA has always opposed adding any new exemptions for closed-door executive sessions to Vermont's open meeting law. We feel exceptions need to be reduced, not expanded. We hope to work with the legislature on reducing exemptions for meetings and public records while continuing to work on more transparency and accountability in government. That's why this special effort to customize the state's open meeting law for the desires of the Vermont Truth and Reconciliation Committee is very alarming. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission is a publicly funded body, and taxpayers have a right to observe and participate in all its work and its hearings. If it is difficult to avoid having a quorum with only 3 members, the logical thing to do is add 2 more members. Vermont municipalities that have 3-member boards are doing just that, some of them, and we would hope you would talk to some of the 3-member boards, if you have not already, to learn how they've been able to operate within the law throughout the years before you consider reducing open government and accountability in Vermont. The Truth and Reconciliation proposal to create an entirely new category of public hearing, a quote unquote closed hearing, is a violation of open meeting law and Vermont's Constitution, which enshrines and protects free speech and open government. To create a new special category of hearing where public voice is muted is abhorrent and flies in the face of open and transparent government. People have a right to participate in the public process in government. There's no need to provide special treatment for one state commission. To assert some vague and undefined threat as a reason for holding a closed hearing is disingenuous and a dangerous precedent with a very real ability for abuse. It's further troublesome that the proposed legislation would allow someone speaking out about hearings that occurred in an affinity group to be subject to civil action for breaching confidentiality. This would be an obvious violation of free speech laws under both the US and Vermont Constitution. The Vermont legislature has always wisely rejected such suggestions through the years because it violates free speech laws and would chill whistleblowers from coming forward with reports of wrongdoing. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission needs to do all of its work and spending of taxpayer money in the open. The VPA, which believes in open government as mandated by the Vermont Constitution, is prepared to testify against the bill and to continue to do so. And we are glad to continue our long-standing relationship with the legislature in our goal to make Vermont one of the most transparent states in the nation. We are aware that this bill seems to be moving swiftly, and we are aware that there are at least 2 other groups that have recently learned about this proposal and are interested in testifying at your next hearing. In closing, we appreciate your time and willingness to take our serious concerns into full consideration. We're here to make and keep government accessible for all the public. And when it comes down to making access to the government easier for the public, we're not here to make the jobs of our elected and appointed officials easier. Democracy is messy, and government is supposed to be transparent. I thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Ms. Loomis. Are you willing to take some questions? I was hoping that what we might be able to do
I
this
can't hear you. Could you, you're mute, something's muted.
looks like the room
Let me just
muted.
try to put up my volume. Can you
Yeah,
try
it
that
looks like,
again?
yeah, can you hear me now?
Barely, but I can hear you. Actually, let me just take,
Yeah, let me know if this sounds okay.
okay, fire away.
Yeah, can you hear me okay, Ms. Loomis?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Fine now is pretty repeated, so we're gonna try and turn you up here. Could you try talking again just to make sure we can hear you?
Test, test, test. How's that? Well, let me go back to my earbuds then, 1 second.
Yeah, no problem. We can hear you, but it's a little soft, so
Okay, how's that?
that sounds much better. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you. Okay.
Great. So you brought up a number of concerns, and I think our committee is interested this morning in making sure that we take those seriously, and also kind of understand the concerns in the context of the other testimony we've heard and the sort of mission and scope of work that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has. So I wanted to maybe first ask about the concern around the hybrid and remote meetings generally. You mentioned the open meeting law changes that were extended last year by Act 1 in terms of the ability for many public bodies in Vermont to meet remotely. And I know our Senate colleagues are working on S55, which has to do with that more broadly. And I wanted to understand if you share the sense that I've had as we've discussed those issues over the last few years, that there's a balance between access and that there is a big debate in Vermont about whether it is more beneficial to the public to have every meeting have an electronic participation element. And if I understand your testimony correctly, the Vermont Press Association's position is every meeting must have a physical location.
Yes, that's a multifaceted question. So let's back up. The pandemic made it possible for all of us to meet remotely, and that was amazing. And it did and remote access to government meetings did amazing things. It allowed much more public participation in the process because sometimes no one wants to drive to the town offices at 6 o'clock on a snowy night when they could actually Zoom in and eat dinner while listening what their elected officials do. Right. So those are actually good things. We've had some planning commission meetings here in the town of Warren, which attracted 75 or 80 people to talk about updating zoning ordinances. That's unheard of. But the other side of it is not everybody has the ability to Zoom in. Not everybody has that access. We watched during the pandemic as so many school kids had to do their homework in the parking lot of McDonald's or the library because of lack of broadband. So it becomes a public access to government equity issue. And there's another thing that happens when a meeting is taking place, and let's say you're looking at a document with a proposed budget from the town of Waitsfield that calls for increasing wages by, I'm going to make this up, 50%. If I'm present at the meeting, I can request any public document being discussed at a meeting to be given to me at that time. And if I don't have access, if I don't have digital access, I cannot. And that's a real thing for reporters and press people. Like, you want the documents that are being publicly discussed at public hearings. So yes, we do feel very strongly there needs to be a home base, is what Mike Donahue calls it. We feel that that's an important aspect of the public's ability to participate in the process. And I believe that the New England First Amendment Coalition shares that position, that there needs to be a public place, and not just the town clerk or the town administrator, but there needs to be one designee of the specific board, whether it's planning commission, DRB, or select board.
Folks from the committee have any questions for Ms. Loomis on this particular issue? Representative Morgan?
Yep, thank you, Mr. Chair. I do, because this is actually on behalf of Rep. Pango, and she brought up the same point Lisa did. You talked to Lisa, taking testimony from 3-member boards, and she'd asked that I broach that this morning, so I'm doing that on her behalf, to see how they deal with their quorum issues, and she felt that was an important or a critical piece of her knowledge that she would like to have.
I'm sorry, I missed the question part.
Well,
of that.
I'm sorry, it was more of a statement, Lisa, but I think
Okay.
she, in other words, a fellow representative in the committee she had to be elsewhere to testify on something this morning, wanted to make sure that I brought up on her behalf something that mirrors what you said about taking some more testimony about 3-member boards.
Yes, thank you. We appreciate that. And there are boards, Fayston, the Valley Reporter covers the town of Fayston, which has had a 3-member board for probably 100 years. But other towns are getting away from it because there's the issue of a quorum, and we all live in small towns, most of us, and you can actually have a quorum in the grocery store line.
Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Nope, that's it.
I just had a town in my district that is a 3-member select board, and I believe, if I understand it correctly, they've got it on their ballot this year to go to it because of those kinds of issues. But nevertheless, they're constrained to that at the moment.
As soon as on that point, one of the questions I was going to ask is distinguishing between the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which, largely the end result of their work will be recommendations and report. They're not actually empowered to spend money, for instance, or so they have a number of powers, but they don't have the kind of power that, say, a legislative body has. And I'm wondering how that plays into thinking about, the appropriateness of the size of that commission versus a 3-member select board that is, has their own budget and their own ability to act as a legislative body.
Well, I think that would be a question for the legislation and the committee that created the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I mean, short, absent legislative powers, it is different that perhaps 3 people can do it, but the members themselves of the commission have raised the issue of a quorum, and it's hard to get their work done. So that's coming from them. And I honestly can't speak legislatively to the efficacy of 3 or 5-member boards. Many of the boards I cover are 5-member with legislative powers. One is 3 members. I think your commission members are telling you that they can't do their jobs, is what I understand them saying, in part of the reasoning for this legislation. They want rules to be changed so that they don't have to work openly because they're bumping into quorum issues, as I understand the legislation.
Representative Higley.
No, I'd just like to clarify what I heard from the commissioners wasn't that they were being hindered by having 3 members. They were being hindered by only having 2 currently. And we even asked them whether or not they thought 5 would be better. And they basically didn't answer or answered to the point that they thought 3 was sufficient.
Okay, that's good information.
Yeah, I would echo what Representative Higley was putting up, which is that the main thrust of this bill is not about the issue of a quorum. It's the fact that there are only currently now 2 members. And because of the selection process that was set out in the original Truth and Reconciliation Commission bill last biennium, they don't have a mechanism to effectively replace the 3rd member who resigned. So that's the main reason why there's urgency around this, is because if they're going to do their work, we would want them to have all 3 commissioners as originally envisioned. And some of the effort that was done around selecting them. So I wanted to not necessarily engage in a debate, but maybe just offer a reframing of what we're trying to do in response to the claim that there's an effort afoot here in the legislature to, somehow make government less transparent. I think may have been one of your initial comments,
Yes.
Ms. Lumens. And this committee, I have seen be really dedicated to making sure that the public has access and the ability to see an open and transparent government across all levels. And at the same time, the pandemic has brought up a whole bunch of questions that we're grappling with across state government and municipal government. And so I really appreciate the concern about a physical location requirement. And that's something I take really seriously. I wanted to maybe, if unless the committee has any more questions for Ms. Loomis about the issues of the 3-member board or the open meeting pieces, to move on to a couple of other things, but Representative Chase.
Can I?
Oh, yeah.
Can I just
Go ahead.
respond to what you said? So I am sympathetic to the fact that it's a 2-member board currently, and that the process for appointing a third person is complicated. And that's a process issue. That's a nuts and bolts thing. That is not a principles of free speech and open government issue. We feel it's a slippery slope to make an exception for one of the state's commissions or committees or boards or organizations, and that our open meeting laws need to be respected 100% across the board by every single entity that is governing us or working like the commission is.
Chase.
Following on that, I think I heard you talk about concerns for executive session and additional concerns about punitive measures for people that share information outside of the affinity groups. A lot of the topics that I understand they'd be talking about in these situations are deeply personal, private information, perhaps medical, perhaps related to mental health, psychological well-being, et cetera. And I think I'm hearing no distinction there, that there should be all of this information should be open and aired to the public, regardless of how the victims feel about it. And not only that, but anybody who does share something should have no expectation of privacy. And, so if somebody decides to blast this across the front page of your newspaper, for example, there should be no repercussions for that. Can you speak to that a little bit more, and why that, potentially, it's not quite HIPAA because it's not healthcare providers, but related information should have no protections?
Well, I believe, if I understand what I've read, that many instances when people are participating or testifying, that they are already anonymous. And in that instance, it would be, let's think about the point of the work that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is doing. How can we as a state understand and learn the impacts of past behaviors if we don't know them? There is a very real reason for, if not the identities, certainly they can be protected, but the gist of that information should be public so that people can understand.
Well, then maybe I misunderstood you. It sounded like there shouldn't be any repercussions for people who do share that information, and that there should be limited or even no executive sessions to uncover that information in the first place.
I think that any board member who participates in an executive session has their own legal obligations to protect that information. The distinction we're hearing, and it's a little unclear from what we've read in the legislation, is that it seems to create civil penalties for somebody who shares information revealed in an affinity group. So it's unclear who participants are in affinity groups. There's a lack of clarity in this bill that requires a little more study before it is passed out of committee or passed on. There's a real concern that whistleblowers perhaps a member of an affinity group may see or hear some internal wrongdoing that actually requires the light of public scrutiny. It happens. And
So I
also,
want
go ahead.
to, no, go ahead, Ms. Loomis, sorry.
Well, I also think that journalists in our state have a great deal of integrity, and I feel like we can watch the sausage get made and still serve the public without revealing sensitive information. Journalists do that all the time, day in and day out. Use their judgment and their ethics to determine how much of a story to pursue. We use our off-the-record relationships with all kinds of context to actually understand context, so we know that if a story does need to be pursued.
So a couple of things I think might have gotten conflated in the exchange that you just had with Representative Chase. And I think that we'll talk about this further throughout today with Legislative Council to make sure everybody on the committee really understands the distinction between three things that are included in different parts of this bill that are very separate and distinct and have different reasons for existing and different protocols that need to be followed. And I think are meant to be in concert with all of our principles with open meeting law. So one thing that just got mentioned was executive session. So an executive session is actually when we're talking about the work of the commission itself, their meetings, them having a finding that they have to go into executive session, right? But I think where we started with the exchange between you, Ms. Loomis, and Representative Chase was talking about the affinity groups requests. And it's been made clear to us that an affinity group would be a group under the auspices of the commission, but that would not be a public meeting. It would actually be a confidential, completely private meeting that was facilitated by commission staff and perhaps organized by the commission itself, but that were individuals who had been impacted in a particular way that could come together to discuss those things and get support. And the way it was characterized to us in Ms. Olvera and the commissioner's testimony was that it would be in large part a way to have people who had come forward with maybe difficult testimony to offer some support to them after they had given testimony in an official capacity to the board as part of its investigations or part of its hearings and proceed to the commission rather as part of its investigations or proceedings. So the affinity group isn't a recommendation for like a public body to be created. It's the ability for the commission to bring people together who've been impacted by some of the things that the commission is studying. And so I think it has a completely separate and different set of concerns about confidentiality and transparency than does the actual official proceedings of the commission. And I think that I understand why there can be some misunderstanding about that, as you know, much of this bill is about the official proceedings. And then there's this new power that we're saying, yeah, you can have confidential affinity groups. And I take very seriously the recommendation that we might want to better define what those are before we move the bill. And part of that is that we asked our colleagues in the House Judiciary Committee actually to weigh in on the specific right of action as it relates to the affinity group. So I just wanted to, in response to some of the comments, say that we are looking at that, but that I just didn't want us to get kind of lost in conflating executive session and the affinity groups. The last thing I wanted to ask you about, Ms. Loomis, is to just clarify with you what your concerns are about the provisions that are in the draft bill around the closed meeting power, which is very different from executive session or these affinity groups. And I think might have been the most misunderstood part of our conversation from last week. If I take some of the conversations I've had.
Great, thank you. And thanks for that clarification around affinity groups. As it's written, that is not clear. And I think it needs to be clarified, and the Press Association would like to read that new language and weigh in again, as will these other groups that are interested. And so the closed meeting is perhaps one of the most troublesome things of all. I, as a journalist, represent the public, and I have the right to participate in my government in real time, all the time, every time. To hold a meeting that is closed, where only, for example, you guys get to talk and nobody from the public can interact, can sit in the room, can react in real time to what is being proposed or what is being said, what a board member says, what another member of the public says, that's a complete violation of open meeting law in our perspective. It's a very troublesome precedent to have somebody to exclude the public from a closed but public hearing is an astonishing concept. Now, if I've misunderstood it, please let me know.
So in your opening statement, Ms. Loomis, you suggested that it was unconstitutional, not just a violation of open meeting law, for a body like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to take a vote to find that there was a material threat against their safety or the safety of the people testifying before them, and to have a meeting, as I understand it, that would bar members of the public, but would still be recorded, live streamed, that there would still be a record. And so I'm trying to weigh the very real concern that this commission is particularly, I think, subject to the potential for disruption from members of the public, and that they might, if they make that finding that there's actually a material threat against them.
Well, I'm happy to answer that question.
Yeah.
You know, we live in the Trumpian era of politics, and I think one might argue that there's always a threat of violence and anger and profanity and God knows what happening in a public hearing. And I think if you create a special category where the potential for some undefined, unidentified, not yet materialized threat to close out the public is inappropriate. Remember when we all first started to learn to use Zoom and we were getting broken into by hackers from Singapore and beyond with pornographic images dancing on public screens? Remember that? We all quickly learned how to shut down a meeting. We all know how to shut down someone's audio if it's a digital meeting. I believe we all can figure out in our actual open public meetings how to control and how to confront potential violence. It's in my 3 years, that's true, 3 decades of working in journalism in Vermont, there have been 2 instances where there were any potential for any possibility of more than raised voices. And in both instances, the boards knew ahead of time and had the local sheriff and or a state police officer in the room.
So Ms. Loomis, I'm going back to the text itself, and I want to make really clear that I understand that the Vermont Press Association is concerned about the possibility of a closed meeting in the event that there's an official on the record finding of a material threat to the health or safety of the commission, its staff, witnesses, invitees, to close a meeting. I think about what has occasionally happened here in legislative meetings where there have been threats against the safety or people who are disruptive, and that we're able to, have Capitol Police, close a room and it's still recorded. That's very rare. I wouldn't take that lightly, but I think that the language here is really explicit. There has to be a finding of a material threat. So I just wanted to be really clear that the Vermont Press Association is totally opposed to closed meetings, even if they're still recorded and live streams under any circumstance.
Yes, and I think you identified it yourself. You said it's been very rare in the State House. As I said, I've seen twice in many, many years of covering local news and statewide news where law enforcement has been needed. It's very rare. And I think absent very specific standards and guidelines, and I mean much more clear than you have in this proposed legislation, we are opposed to it. Public meetings are public meetings. I have a right to participate in a public meeting.
other folks from the committee have questions? Representative Waters Evans.
Sure, I have 6,000. My first question is actually, what, as far as, the physical meetings, right, and not requiring a physical location, are there any other committees, commissions, boards, meetings, anything like that that currently exist that don't require a physical location?
Sorry, you were
It-
breaking up just a little bit. I didn't catch all of that.
So I know there are COVID exceptions that we've made over the last few years for requiring a physical location for a meeting. Is there, I'm wondering, and I don't know if you know the answer to this, maybe someone here does, if there are any other boards or committees or any other gatherings that are subject to open meeting law that don't require a physical location other than the COVID stuff? Is there any other exception to this rule other than this right here?
So I think that's a great question.
Yeah.
We need to work through with legislative council and we will have them up next. So I think that might not be,
Okay,
I think the Vermont Press Association's made their opinion very clear about
oh, sure,
fully remote meetings. So
yeah,
if you have questions for Ms. Loomis, I would say
okay,
we'll have those first and then, but that one is one Representative Waters Evans, we should definitely work through
Okay.
with
I wasn't
Tucker. I think
okay,
what's tricky about this is this language in here, as we discussed last time we met on this bill, largely mirrors what we did in Act One.
right,
But there's also, movement around what is the long-term reality of remote meetings going to be generally. So I think we need to answer the question of, do we want to do this carve out now just for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission? Or do we want to have them fall back on whatever we do with general law after, through July 1st,
Yeah.
it's one thing. And then after July 1st, it's going to be whatever we decide in the context of that open meeting law bill that's making its way in the Senate right now.
okay.
So I'd say if you have other questions for the Vermont Press Association, go for it.
I think my only other question would be, could you explain what the impact would be on the Press Association on journalism if these meetings, it should be, if we would continue with this bill exactly as it's written right now, what would the effects be? What are the fears of the repercussions of this legislation?
Well, we, the Press Association, are
Yes.
journalists and we report news to our state, but we perform a very important function is we shine the light of public scrutiny on the actions of our elected and appointed officials. And we also, very importantly, we represent the public. So if you hold closed meetings or if you hold digital only meetings, sure, some of us can participate. Not closed meetings. If you hold digital only meetings with no location, sure, some of us can participate, but not everyone. And we represent the public. And if the public can't, if Joe Smith from the convenience store cannot come to his select board and talk about the budget or talk about the dog ordinance or talk about the zoning ordinance that's under consideration or the town plan, that takes away his or her ability to participate actively in real time in the public process. That's the most important thing we feel that we can do, is ensure that we and the public can participate in the public process in real time, in reaction to what is being said and heard. In particular, if you don't have access to high-speed internet or the ability to participate digitally, we have to have people able to come to their public meetings and participate.
Thank you.
And I can speak more to the closed hearings, but I think I've been pretty clear on that.
Representative Nugent.
This might be a question for legislative council also, but I'm just wondering, what exists now in law that lets us expel someone who's threatening, like, from this room? And is that sufficient for this bill that we're working on? Or is there a benefit to having it more clearly stated in the bill that?
That is a great question for legislative counsel. As long as, I don't know if you want to take, if you have any comments about that, I think your position on our ability to keep the public out of meetings is fairly clear, but yeah, the interaction between our House rules and the way the State House works and the open meeting law are also a subject of debate, and I think would be one of debate between us and the Vermont Press Association that maybe we don't want to go down the rabbit hole today.
Fair enough. Fair enough. We're happy to speak to that when the time comes. Mike, our executive director, though, has a comment.
Great. I do want to welcome Mike, and if you could introduce yourself for the record, please go ahead.
Sure. My name is Mike Donahue. I'm the executive director of the Vermont Press Association. I'm a retired Burlington Free Press reporter, and I still do occasional freelance writing for some papers in Vermont. I was over in House Judiciary on the same bill that they're taking up this morning at the same time. And that's why I was late, and I apologize for missing the first half hour or so. Just a quick answer to that question. Basically, the chair, like you, have the right to control the meeting and how it's operating, and they can evict anybody from a meeting. So that's the short answer to how you control a meeting, that if somebody's out of control, the chair can ask that person be removed or ask the person to leave. And that's been done. I've seen that happen at a lot of public meetings in my 5 decades of covering a lot of government meetings, many of them boring, by the way.
Representative Byron.
Thank you. No, I want to thank both of you for coming in today and giving us your perspective on this. It's really valuable while we're trying to unpack this one and set the table for the next conversations. I did want to take a second to just speak to one of the positions that both of you have made with your perspective on this. With you're speaking very intently and definitively to the past. And we have seen over the last few years, unfortunately, some dark corners of internet function, capacity, participation, shall we say, seep into the work that we do here. And with this particular committee, one of the concerns with the dark corners of the internet is a couple of things: fear and safety for themselves as a body, but fear and safety to not just physical threat, but intimidation to the participants. And these are individuals who the whole point of this commission is to get people who've been marginalized and boxed out of a lot of societal engagement to have a venue to be honest and not be threatened. So I think that's a really important consideration that needs to be pointed out here. And I apologize, I arrived a little late this morning, but I didn't feel that that piece was spoken to. And it's just this conversation we're having right now is a horrible reality to some of the, shall I say, fringy engagement we've been experiencing as we continue to try and do our jobs and set up commissions and panels and bodies such as this. So I just wanted to, I don't really have a question for you. I just wanted to speak to that point.
Well, I would say this in response to that. You know, the fact that there are ill-behaved bores in the internet is true, and that marginalized groups of people need protection is also true. And I believe there are ways to do that without throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And I think that there are creative legislative solutions that can be found, that can be brought to bear, that will protect open meeting laws and open, transparent government, and also protect marginalized groups. And Mike, do you want to weigh in there?
I guess I would just say that, you know, yes, we are looking in the past, and this committee through the years, through the decades, has actually worked to increase transparency. So some of you may know that Vermont for the longest time was ranked 48th, 49th, or 50th as being the least transparent states in the United States. And the Press Association and other groups have worked with this committee quite closely over the years to try to get you guys moved up. And it had worked. And, you know, I always maintained you ought to be aiming for the top 5, but, you know, I'm not sure we're there yet. But this bill creating exemptions and the bothersome thing to me is that you're creating a separate right of action to somebody to sue a state committee or a state board or state employees if they in fact say something about what has been said to them supposedly during an executive session or in confidence.
So I want to be really clear, Mr. Donahue, and we tried to clear this up before. The confidentiality and the privacy language that's in section 10 that we asked the Judiciary Committee to review and the right of action that's related to it is not related to executive session. I just wanted to just clear that up. It's only related to the affinity group proposal, which are not open, they're not meetings of the commission itself.
But if something from one of those affinity groups is shared with a governmental board, presumably that right of action would be extended. Being an amateur lawyer, I would think, to that meeting.
So we're gonna have extensive conversations with legislative counsel to try to address this concern. Because I think it's really important for us to be totally clear about how the different sections of the proposals in this bill operate. And Lisa brought up some really good points while you were up in Judiciary that we will dive into. So I want to be really clear. We're taking the concern about the affinity group seriously. And we have a lot of questions for legislative counsel in response. But if I understand your testimony right, Mike, it's that the concern is that if we have these affinity groups and they're meeting under the auspices of the commission and members of the public that are participating in them, knowing that everyone who's participating has agreed to keep what they heard there confidential, they're designed to support each other outside of the, you know, and probably after or during the commission's investigation and what are some difficult things. The idea is that we're trying to create an environment where everybody knows that things really seriously have to stay inside those affinity groups. Otherwise, people wouldn't participate. And those are not the public proceedings of the commission where they're making a decision. That's a support structure for folks who may have come forward with some very difficult experiences.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, no, I understand that, but I'm suggesting that if something in an affinity group then proceeds and is mentioned during one of these commission meetings somehow, and whether it's a threat, a crime, false information, child abuse, or some sort of information that probably ought to get out, there's still, by encouraging a separate right of action, then whistleblowers are going to be a little less likely to come forward if they did in fact hear a threat, a crime, child abuse, or anything. And so I guess that's what we want to make sure doesn't happen. So I appreciate you saying you're going to be taking a deep dive with legislative counsel on these questions.
Representative Hooper has a question. Thanks for your patience, Jay. I didn't see your hand up before.
Oh, no problem, Mr. Chair. Good morning, everyone. So it seems to me like this conversation has kind of gotten off topic. I mean, this bill is intended, right, to facilitate the work of a commission that is operating on a fairly time-sensitive basis, basically to allow them to continue to work while we figure out the answers to those other questions regarding precedent and government participation and updating that landscape. is that correct, Mr. Chair? Have I got that right? Like, we're talking today about the conduct by which a commission would facilitate testimony and the extensions of that commission's activities to that effect. It's not really about the mission at hand, right? I mean, have I got that right?
Yeah, so it is complicated. I think we have a lot of questions we've identified for legislative counsel about the mechanics that we would want to use in order to facilitate that work. So at the outset of this, and I appreciate you bringing this back up, Representative Hooper, you know, we are really not seeking to reopen the entire conversation about how the Truth and Reconciliation Committee was formed or its scope of work. The commission has come forward with these recommendations and requests because primarily they don't have a mechanism to replace the third member who resigned. So that's
Right.
kind of the first impetus. But then these other requests around the flexibility that we would give them or powers that we would give them are things that we have to weigh. Yeah.
So
And the thing
I
you
guess-
bring up in particular is the open meeting law pieces that right now were extended by Act 1 last year through July 1st.
Sure.
And we would be extending them just for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission if we took up the language as it's been presented to us.
Okay, yeah. So the reframing concept like that, it seems to me like we shouldn't forget what the point is, acting swiftly on this. But I guess my question for Lisa would be, you mentioned there were two other interests that had desire to weigh in on this bill. Who are they?
The New England First Amendment Coalition and the ACLU.
Okay.
And I would just like to mention, in terms of reframing, we understand the immediacy of the work of the commission, and you cannot create state open meeting law exemptions for one organization. You cannot customize open meeting law to the needs of one organization. There's a structural issue with how that commission was created in that they don't have a mechanism for appointing or finding a third member, but that's no reason to gut our open meeting laws.
Point well taken. I am curious also, you mentioned that you were observing other aspects of diminished transparency in this current General Assembly. Can you highlight those places? Where else do you see the Senate and the House in Vermont trying to make or what policies are doing that?
I think either I misspoke or you misunderstood me. We don't have an issue with the way the House and Senate are conducting ourselves. We have concerns and would like to see some sort of a legislative summer committee to work on open meeting law. There are issues with executive session and how it is enacted and how boards use it. But no, we're not, our testimony is not to suggest there's something nefarious going on right now.
Certainly. Okay. Well, then in that case, I appreciate the clarity. Your testimony today has been, I understand the significance of your insistence that we don't go down a certain path. So I appreciate you showing or offering your commentary today. What was my last question? I guess I'll yield the floor. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
So yes, Mr. Donahue, go ahead.
And I don't know, again, my apologies because I was over at House Judiciary. I don't know if Lisa addressed this thing. I mean, I guess the concern that there's been out there for a long, long time since, going way back, is 3-member committees anyway. I mean, select boards, school boards, whatever. There's always been this issue of if you talk to another member on the board, you're in violation of the open meeting law as soon as you start talking about anything dealing with it. And I would hopefully, it would be great if you could somehow, get to a 5-member board and things like that. I know the tiny town of Islamont is going to the voters' town meeting in March, asking their 3-member board to be expanded to 5, because again, when they talk to one another, they're in violation of the open meeting law very much. And if there's more people on the board, there's more work to be shared. And I just throw that out there that, and I realize that that can't be done overnight, but you might consider going to a 5-member board, and that would eliminate some of the problems too. Thank you.
Representative Chase has a question.
Mr. Donahue, I just want to clarify something. The board that you just referenced is allowed to talk to each other. They're just not allowed to talk business with each other. So if they run into each other in the store, they're not precluded from discussing anything other than town business. So that is separate and distinct from what we're talking about here, which is a team of people who are full-time employees being precluded from discussing anything to do with their operations.
No, I fully understand that. Yeah, in the context of business, if you're talking about last week's football game and things like that, they're free to talk about.
So I would invite Lisa and Mike to stay with us. I wanted to get to our next witness. Hayes is here from the Vermont Broadcasters Association. So thanks for joining us. Vermont Association of Broadcasters, sorry.
Before that begins, I thank you very much for your time and your willingness to listen to our testimony and take my questions. I have to hop off, but Mike will stay and represent us. I'm on deadline for production of this week's paper.
Thanks for being here, Lisa.
Mike, over to you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. My name is Wendy Mays, and I am the Executive Director of the Vermont Association of Broadcasters. Thank you so much for allowing me to speak on behalf of the trusted television and radio broadcast newsrooms who are dedicated to keeping the public informed with fact-based, non-biased reporting. I'd like to start by going back to something that I do feel has gotten lost, and that is the intent of Section 1 of Act 128. The intent, as it's stated in Act 128, is of the Vermont Truth and Reconciliation Commission, is to, quote, examine and establish a public record of institutional, structural, and systemic discrimination in Vermont, both past and present, caused or permitted by state laws and policies. The work that this commission is about to undertake is extremely important, and the recommendation report that they generate will be consequential to all Vermonters, especially if reparations paid with taxpayer dollars are deemed appropriate. Yet sections 8, 9, and 10 of H 649 propose that the majority of the Vermont Truth and Reconciliation Commission work be done away from the public eye. How can a public record of systemic discrimination be established and actions be taken if the public does not have access to the majority of information that led to the commission's recommendations? Now, I'm going to go through each section, 8, 9, and 10 separately, just so that there are no misunderstandings. Section 8 of H 649 says that any individual can elect to have their interview conducted in private and the recording kept confidential, without having to provide reason, justification, or specified criteria. There is nothing to prevent every interviewee from taking this option, which means that there would be no public record of what was said in these interviews. That same section of Section 8 goes on to say, all records of interviews shall only be available to the public in an anonymized form. So if the public will not be able to identify any interviewees, then why do the interviews need to be done in private and then and the recordings kept confidential? Moving on to Section 9. Section 9 of H 649 proposes 3 exemptions to Vermont's open meeting law that are very concerning. Number 1, allowing a quorum of commissioners to discuss and deliberate commission business in secret. Open meeting law exists to ensure that the public has access to the discussions and deliberations that go into making the laws that govern them. Exempting this commission from that obligation because it's more convenient for the commissioners is not a good enough reason to suspend one of the most important elements of the democratic process. In addition, it sets precedent for every other 3-member board, council, and commission who want the same accommodations. Number 2, allowing commissioners to meet virtually only with no physical place where the public can attend. Whether it's because they don't have the means to own a computer or because broadband is not available in that area, many Vermonters do not have access to the internet. Making public meetings available to view online is a very helpful tool that should be used in conjunction with, but not in place of, physical meetings. And number 3, allowing commissioners to close a meeting at their discretion with no verifiable reason. And I understand that a closed meeting would still be live streamed and recorded. But this method takes away the public's opportunity to request to comment or request to ask questions or hear the conversations happening before or after the live button is activated, or read the facial expressions of the people in the room, or even see if the people in the room are listening and paying attention. While H649 was being discussed this past Thursday, Legislative Counsel said commissioners could give a reason as vague as, quote, part of an ongoing legal case to close a meeting. That is not a material threat, good enough reason to suspend one of the most important elements of the democratic process. Section 10 of H649, the establishment of affinity groups, is puzzling. What does the creation of affinity groups do to further the intent of Act 128? If affinity group sessions are akin to therapy, and intended only to give victims of discrimination a confidential forum to empathize with other victims, why does it need to be in statute? However, if commissioners and/or their staff are present during these confidential sessions, the stories they hear will impact their recommendations to the legislature. But there will be no public record of how they arrived at that recommendation. The protection of one's identity is already guaranteed in Section 8. So should they choose to come forward and share their story? So why are affinity group protections needed in statute other than as a loophole to Vermont's Public Records Act and open meeting law? Again, the intent of Act 128 in creating the Vermont Truth and Reconciliation Commission is listed as, and in part as, to examine and establish a public record of institutional, structural, and systemic discrimination in Vermont, both past and present, caused or permitted by state laws and policies. The exemptions to open meeting law that would enable this commission to conduct most of their work out of the public eye is in direct contradiction to the intent of Act 128, excuse me. In addition, if you change the law for one group based on the what ifs, because the work they're doing could be considered sensitive, you're setting precedent for every public body to make an argument that the work they could be doing is sensitive and that they should have the same accommodations. That is a very slippery slope. It is for these reasons that the Vermont Association of Broadcasters oppose sections 8, 9, and 10 of H649, and we ask this committee to consider a strike all of those 3 sections, with the exception of the language in Section 8 that says all records of interviews shall only be available to the public in an anonymized form. That way, your committee can move forward with the important selection process for a new commissioner. Thank you.
So I have one quick clarification before we get to committee questions. So you had mentioned in your testimony the reasons for going into a closed meeting.
Mhm.
I believe that the comment that you quoted was about reasons to go into executive session. And those are very clearly laid out. And I don't believe there's any deviation in what is being recommended from current reasons why any public body can go into an executive session. Part of the struggle that we had as we took up this bill is that this bill includes reference to executive session, which we're not really changing, but there's a reference to it, a new definition of what a closed meeting is, and also this new power of developing these affinity groups. And I think it's created a confusion that's been exacerbated by some of the coverage. And I just want to make sure that in here, we're all trying to be really clear about which pieces we're talking about and where the concerns lie. So did I misunderstand that particular section of your testimony?
Well, here's the funny part. So I have actually watched every second of the discussion that you all have had on Tuesday and on Thursday. It is entirely possible that I thought that that's what you were discussing, but I was watching from home. And so that just goes to prove the point that sometimes things get lost in translation when you're watching from home. You can't hear what somebody says. You don't know which part they were talking about. So it is entirely possible, but yeah.
We will definitely get that cleared up with legislative counsel as well, but I just wanted to make sure before we dove in. Anybody in the committee have questions for Ms. Mays? I think you were very clear in your concerns, so thank you for flagging those. So committee, I would like to invite Michelle Olvera from the commission, if she's willing, to maybe give us some testimony and answer some questions. And then we'll take a break and then we'll come back and dive into things with legislative counsel. If that makes sense to everybody representing me, go ahead.
Thank you, and I'm glad she can testify. I just wanted to respond to the testimony we heard previously quickly and did not want my silence to be taken as acquiescence with that testimony. I just feel like I am not the person to respond to that testimony, and I'm glad that we can have some testimony.
Yeah, so I really appreciate that, Representative Murlicki. I think we're challenged as a committee in having some urgency around wanting the commission to be able to do its work, and that's kind of the foundational thing. And also, there are several policy considerations here that are before us. So I'm hoping this morning we'll be able to sort of illuminate, get comfortable with some parts, and maybe kick some questions or shave some things down so that we can move the bill. It's my intention that we, since we only had one witness scheduled on H-140, that we continue to work on this morning and sort of delve into some of these things and not switch gears as I had originally planned. I thought, as is so often the case, it's difficult to plan on exactly how long conversations are going to take. So I think we'll postpone continuing H-140 so that we can continue to stay focused here. So Michelle, would you mind coming up and maybe responding to some of the things we heard and take some questions from the committee?
I did. Thank you, Michelle Olvera, General Legal Counsel for the Vermont Commission, Truth and Reconciliation. The press is incredibly important. And for regular Vermonters to know what's going on in their own state is incredibly important. And had Vermonters really known what was going on with the eugenics program, potentially this commission wouldn't even be necessary, right? So part of the problem that we're curing is because Vermonters haven't known what's been going on, which is why our public meetings are so important to us, right? Also, the people that do the work of the state, their safety is important. And I don't want us to become flip about threats being made simply because we're in an era where many people make threats. Also, we're in an era where people carry out those threats. And I don't think it's wise to set them aside and not be prudent about them. So for example, if this committee should decide that meetings must be at a geographic location, or that what you're going to do is wait to talk about everybody's public meetings and coming out of the COVID era. If our commission must meet in person and we've received, which we have, death threats to the commission, I think that puts in jeopardy the people on the commission, because you can't wait until, right, we have already gotten the material threat. It's not, as she was referencing, something that hasn't really come to fruition. It has come to fruition. And if you invite people to your table that have threatened to kill you, that just seems unwise, right? I don't know what else to say about that. And I think we just need to come up with a solution to that. And I really appreciate what I feel like is a lot of support from your committee. I feel like there's been a lot of understanding, and I welcome your solutions about that. And that's the only thing I really wanted to say about questions.
So initially, one question I have is, do I understand it correctly that under Act 1, the commission is currently allowed to have fully remote meetings?
Right, like everyone else under COVID until July 1. That's what we're currently operating under, but we were just looking forward and trying to prepare for safety at that time.
Your questions for Michelle before I start riffing, because I think there were a number of concerns that were brought up that I wanted to maybe frame with her before we delve into the text with legislative council. I was wondering if you could just bring us back on the affinity groups, which we may just say groups in the next draft. I think we already asked legislative council to do that. But that power in section 10 to have those groups, could you remind the committee what the proposal really is and why that would need to be a power that's listed in statute as opposed to, the commission just forming?
And I've come to the conclusion that when Representative Chase said affinity is confusing, you've been really right. And so they're really just support groups. And for people, for example, one of the things that the commission is hearing about is people that had forced sterilizations, right? There's no current nonprofit group around that. For people to be able to have those groups where they're talking to other people that have undergone what they have undergone. And that is some form of reconciliation and healing. And there's actually 3 purposes at the beginning of Act 128. And one of them is to, stop, dismantle institutional, structural, and systematic discrimination. And part 3 of it talks about repairing the damage. So to us, sort of restorative and healing and reconciliation are important. And we wanted to provide that for people. Also, being a victim is something that most people don't really want to share or advertise in their very small communities, like we have so many of in Vermont. And as I was explaining to the committee upstairs, it's not really even just about your own embarrassment, right? Because if it's in the community, your kid might hear about it in school and say, hey, is it true that your mom had this happen to them? If people think that's a possibility, they are not going to participate in these kind of support groups. They don't want to embarrass their family. They don't need it to be in the whole community. And so that was the reason for the duty of confidentiality, which we talked about some changes in the judiciary, which I'm sure Damian will get into, but is not a criminal action and really requires the other individual to be harmed, just like in a regular tort type of case.
Representative Waters seconds.
Thank you. Part of this might be a ledge council question, but so the groups, I'm wondering why they're even subject or part of the open meeting law discussion, and why it's not just I shouldn't say just, but why it's not a group of people meeting for these exact purposes. So I'm wondering, is the public nature of it part of the restoration and the healing process for it to be public?
Right on to the first part of what you said. It has nothing to do with public meetings.
So why is it
Nothing.
part of the statute?
So this is, I think, one of the core confusions.
Got
Most
it.
of this bill is about the
Yeah.
public work of the commission
Right.
and how that will proceed and filling the vacancy and all of that. This one section, section 10, is a new power if I'm understanding the, the bill and the request, to have these support groups created under the auspices of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which doesn't really have any stated power. There's sort of the loose, scope of doing reparative and healing work, but this is a specific power that we would be granting them to form these groups and also give them some weight in their confidentiality by making it really clear to people who are participating that there would be consequences if they share privileged information that they learned inside those groups. So it's separate from the public work. It just happens to be included in this.
It has nothing to do with public meetings whatsoever.
Just section 10 that we're talking about. Representative Chase.
Clarify what I think I heard you just say is the reason why this part is in statute is because they could do the groups on their own, but by putting it in statute means we can set specific bounds of privacy for it. Is that accurate?
Yeah, it's pretty close. It just gives them also the power to even have the groups.
Okay. That they could not do otherwise.
Well, we didn't have that power before.
Okay.
And certainly we couldn't tell people that it would be confidential.
Other questions for Michelle before we dive in a little bit to some of these questions with legislative council? Representative Figueroa.
Yeah, I've got a question. This is a little off topic. Maybe it's for the affinity groups or the new groups. I guess I have a concern or a question in regards to, let's, for example, talk about folks that identify as indigenous. If there's, let's say, 7 members of a group and 5 members talk about discrimination that they feel that they have received, but 2 feel otherwise, how does that relate to a group being considered institutionally or systemically or whatever, affected by Vermont's laws and policies? Again, I want to, are we not allowing somebody from a certain group to testify that feels that they weren't systemically or institutionally or whatever affected?
So you're talking about people that are just bringing us cases generally, not in the affinity group.
Well, I mean, I guess so.
Okay, because the affinity group is people are opting in to talk about their trauma with other people that experience like trauma. So you're unlikely to have someone that said, I didn't experience trauma, but I still want to go to your group, which would be kind of confusing for everyone. But what we put a call out to people to tell us about discrimination that they faced. Right? There are other people in Vermont, perhaps, that feel that they haven't faced discrimination. But we're asking for people to tell us what kind of discrimination they faced in order to help the healing process for them and to try to make it so that other people don't discriminate, don't experience the same.
So I guess in the end, though, when you talk about recommendations for whether it's reparations or whatever, the ones that say they don't feel that there was institutional or some other effect on them, how is that going to be addressed through some form of reparations or consideration?
I mean, I guess what I would say, I suppose, because there are a number of people that went to specific institutions, for example, and felt discriminated against. If I was an individual that went to that institution and I felt like I did not experience discrimination there, I could go to a public meeting and say, my feedback about that case that you just presented is that I feel like that's not true, right? And they could put that on the JAM board, or they could speak it to the commissioners during a public meeting if that was their viewpoint. And we have had at least 1 or 2 people sort of say they didn't believe the identities of the people that were speaking at the public meeting. But our approach has been that people identify themselves in their own identity and they talk from their own experience. we don't really grill people on who they are or what they've experienced. But we do, everybody gets a chance to say their piece.
Okay, thank you.
Damien, did you have something to add there?
I just wanted to clarify that the commission, when the legislature passed this bill, they expressly excluded any option for the commission to award reparations. On the express understanding that anytime reparations are discussed, there needs to be, there's a really high factual standard that needs to be met for reparations to meet constitutional muster. And so they expressly, because the commission isn't a fact-finding commission, they're gathering stories, but they're not acting like a judicial body that would be determining right and wrong or something like that. Reparations were expressly left out. So I just wanted to make sure that we're all, even though that conversation could happen after the commission's report comes out, people could say, we have this documented case of people who were injured, the state should provide them with some sort of reparations, and then the legislature could consider that. Right now, the commission doesn't have the ability to do anything more than say the legislature might want to look into providing reparations in the future. So I just wanted to make sure that we understand like the timing. If reparations ever become a thing, it's going to be after the commission's report comes out, because you need to have clear evidence that the state harmed an individual before the state can actually pay out reparations without getting sued for discrimination or something like that. So just providing reparations based on identity without any proof of harm has been struck down repeatedly in other jurisdictions when they've tried to do it. The only jurisdictions that have successfully provided reparations are ones, I can't remember the southern state, but they also had a sterilization program. And so individuals who were documented as having been sterilized were able to receive reparations from the state, but they needed that documentary evidence before they could even go there. In other instances where states have tried to award contracts or grants or things like that to people who are just members of a broader group, those programs were repeatedly struck down in the courts as being discriminatory because they were based on someone's identity rather than actual harm. So just wanted to be clear that while they're gathering stories, they're not actually deciding, yes, you were harmed and you deserve X number of dollars in reparations or a grant or a special opportunity or something like that. So.
Thank you, Damien. And it's funny, we've heard that word so much, reparations, and we actually say at the beginning, because of that, at the beginning of every meeting, like we don't do reparations. We say that at the very beginning of every meeting. For some reason, that's just a misunderstanding that's come out there. Yeah, just for some reason.
So, and it came up in testimony this morning, so I think I think it's alive in the conversation about the work that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission will do for whatever reason. And so I want to take what you are saying and what the legislation says at face value, and also reiterate that we're trying to just allow the commission to do the work that was set out in the act that was passed last biennium, and not completely reopen the entire conversation. But I appreciate, because it did come up, Damien, just clarifying. I guess what I would ask you, Michelle, is what are really the powers of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission? Because what I think is relevant for us when we're contemplating open meeting law is getting at, is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission three people who are working together to develop a narrative, a body of stories, or is it a quasi-judicial body? Is it more like some public bodies and less like others? That's, I think, the flavor of what some of our conversation is going to be as we move through this afternoon.
Yeah, there is a place that just lists the powers of the commission, but it's definitely not any, we don't do the judicial powers.
Could you just hold on for 1 second? We're having trouble with our live stream and probably need to reboot it. So sorry about that. We'll just have to pause for a moment.
Good, I can do mine.
Okay.
Just duties though.
Oh, yeah, it's not a touch screen. You gotta use the trackpad.
Here we go, powers, here we go.
Yeah.
So it looks like we're on. We'll keep an eye on the live stream, and if we think we're having trouble with the live stream, we can pause. We had one last week, so I want to make sure we're following the rules and the technology is working. It looks like everything's working for right now. So sorry about that. Go ahead, please, Michelle.
So we can do things like get an office, which we did not do. We're working from home and we hope to use any money that we had for offices to go into communities throughout the state. That was our preference. Meet and hold hearings at any place in the state, which we think of as, really our public meetings. Regular public meetings or special public meetings related to emblematic cases is what we are using that. We could adopt rules, 3 VSA 20 and chapter 25. But we really are not having those types of hearings. So we are not going to adopt rules and have those types of hearings because that doesn't really make sense for us. And then we can adopt procedures as necessary to carry out the other duties that are set forth. Hiring folks, communicating with populations, determining what and with other people that know restorative justice or experts in the field, what discrimination has happened, research, public engagement. Those are pretty much the powers of the commission.
So any public policy response to the narratives, the experiences that you gather and reveal in your reports would have to be approved by, debated by the General Assembly. And
of course, we'll be making recommendations based on what people tell us they've experienced.
All right, so committee, we've been at it and I advertised a break here. So what I would like to do is take a 15-minute break. We'll come back at 10:46. So just after 10:45, we'll get back to this and try to dive into some of the language and ask some questions and context on the sections with legislation.